The sound of a mine collapse isn't a crash. It's a scream. It starts deep in the geology. A grinding groan of sandstone rubbing against shale, louder than any machine man ever built. Silas Vance knew that sound. He had heard it in his nightmares for 30 years, but on a Tuesday in November, he heard it with his eyes open, as the lights on his helmet flickered and the dust cloud swallowed the only exit. Silas didn't think about the coal. He didn't think about his paycheck. He thought about the half-finished cup of coffee he left on the kitchen table, and he prayed he'd get to finish it. The alarm clock on the nightstand didn't need to ring. At 3:45 a.m., Silas Vance was already awake, staring at the ceiling of his small frame house in McDowell County, West Virginia. It was a habit carved into his bones, a circadian rhythm dictated not by the sun, but by the shift work that had defined his life since he was 18 years old. Beside him, his wife Clara breathed softly, a rhythmic comfort that stood in stark contrast to the harsh, grinding noise that awaited him. Silas sat up, his joints popping with the familiar stiffness of a man who spent half his life crouched in a 4-foot seam of coal. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, his feet finding the cold hardwood floor. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet you only find in the hollows before the birds wake up. Before the coal trucks start, they rumble down the winding 2-lane roads. He moved to the kitchen in the dark, knowing every creak of the floorboards. He didn't turn on the light. He didn't need to. He went through the ritual that every miner knows. The brewing of the coffee, strong enough to strip paint. The packing of the lunch potato sandwich, wrapped in wax paper, an apple, a thermos of water. These weren't just meals. They were life. In the dark below, that lunch bucket was the only piece of home you had. Silas was a big man, though gravity in the mountain had begun to compress him. His shoulders were broad, permanently slumped forward from years of ducking under roof bolts. His hands were mapped with scars, the knuckles swollen, the fingernails permanently stained, with a thin rim of black dust that no amount of scrubbing could ever fully remove. It was the mark of the trade, the mark of the tribe. He stepped out onto the porch, the screen door slapping shut behind him. The air was crisp, smelling of damp leaves and the faint, sulphurous temps that always hung over the valley. Down the road he could see the headlights of other trucks, a caravan of fireflies winding their way toward the tip. They were his brothers, men bound not by blood, but by the shared risk of the underground. The drive to the mine was automatic. Silas didn't think about the road. His mind was already shifting gears, moving from the soft world of the surface to the hard reality of the pit. He thought about the number 3 entry. The roof had been looking bad yesterday. Working, as they called it. The geological strata shifting, putting pressure on the timbers. He'd need to check the bolt torque first thing. Arriving at the bathhouse, the atmosphere changed. It was a locker room, but it felt more like a staging ground for infantry. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of industrial soap and old sweat. Men were changing out of their street clothes there, civilian clothes, and into their grays. The uniforms were heavy, reinforced with reflective strips that glowed like cat eyes in the dark. "Morning, Silas!" a voice called out. It was young Jimmy Miller, a red hat, a rookie with less than 6 months underground. He looked too clean, too eager. Silas nodded, tightening his belt. "Keep your head down today, Jimmy. That top is tender in Sector 4. Silas wasn't a man of many words, but when he spoke about safety, everyone listened. He had survived 3 decades without a major accident. In this business, that made you a wizard. They gathered at the elevator, the cage that would lower them 600 feet into the earth. The banter died down as the cage rattled shut. It was a transition point, a psychological air. As the sunlight disappeared above them, replaced by the damp, cool air of the shaft, the men went silent. They were leaving the world of the living, the world of sunlight and wind, and entering a world where humans were intruders. The mine was a labyrinth, miles of tunnels honeycombed beneath the mountains, held up by pillars of coal and steel bolts driven into the rock above. It was dark, not the darkness of a bedroom at night, but a total, suffocating absence of light. The only illumination came from the cap lamps on their helmets, cutting focused beams through the suspended dust. Silas climbed onto the mantrip, a low-slung rail car designed to shuttle men to the working face. The ride was bumpy, the metal wheels screeching against the tracks. They traveled for 3 miles, deeper and deeper away from the shaft. The air grew heavier, warmer. The smell of the earth was overpowering, a mix of crushed rock, oil, and the ancient, organic scent of the coal itself. When they reached the face, the section where the coal was actively being cut, the noise began. The continuous menorah, massive machine with a rotating drum of steel teeth, rowhead to life. It chewed into the black seam, tearing the coal from the wall and loading it onto a shuttle car. The dust was instantaneous. Despite the water sprays and the ventilation fans, the air filled with a fine black mist. Silas moved with practiced efficiency. He checked the methane monitors. He tapped the roof with a sounding rod, listening for the hollow thud that indicated loose rock. He watched the ribs, the walls of the tunnel for signs of spalling, where pressure causes the coal to flake off. He was the section foreman, the shepherd of this crew. His eyes were constantly scanning, looking for the invisible dangers that killed men. For the first 4 hours, the shift was routine. The machine roared, the shuttle cars ran back and forth, and the coal flowed. But Silas couldn't shake a feeling of unease. The air felt stagnant. The ventilation canvas, usually flapping with the breeze of the intake fans, was hanging limp. He signaled to the operator to shut down the machine. The sudden silence was deafening. "What's wrong, boss?" Jimmy asked, wiping sweat and grime from his forehead. Silas didn't answer immediately. He tilted his head, listening. "The mind talks to you, if you know how to listen. Usually, it's a low hum of distant machinery. Today, it was a groan, a deep, tectonic shifting sound coming from the older workings to the north. "Get the men back," Silas said, his voice low but urgent. "Pull back to the feeder." Now, the men didn't argue. They saw the look in his eyes. They began to move, gathering their tools. But the mountain didn't wait. It didn't care about their schedules or their safety. It happened in seconds. A bump, a sudden release of geological stress. The floor of the mine heaved upward, throwing Silas to his knees. The air pressure spiked, popping his ears violently. Then came the sound, a thunderous crack, like the spine of the world snapping. The lights flickered and died as the main power cable was severed. Dust billowed out, a blinding, choking cloud that tasted of copper and ash. Silas scrambled for his radio, but it was dead. Sound off. He screamed into the darkness, his own cap lamp cutting a frantic arc through the dust. "Jimmy! Tom! Sound off!" "Here." A voice coughed from the left. "I'm here." It was Tom, the shuttle car operator. "Jimmy's with me." Silas crawled toward them. The ceiling of the tunnel significantly lower now. The roof hadn't collapsed completely, but the pillars had failed, causing the floor to heave and the roof to sag. They were in a squeeze. "We're cut off!" Silas realized, shining his light down the main entry. A wall of rubble blocked the path back to the shaft. The intake airway was crushed. They were trapped in a pocket, perhaps 300 feet long, with thousands of tons of rock between them and the surface. The reality of it settled on him like a physical weight. Back on the surface, the sun was high in the sky. Clara was in her garden, pulling weeds from the tomato patch. She wiped her hands on her apron, looking up at the mountains. A shiver ran through her, unrelated to the temperature. She paused, her hand going to the cross she wore around her neck. She didn't know why, but she felt a sudden, sharp need to pray. In the town, the sirens began to wail. It wasn't the noon whistle. It was the emergency siren, a rising and falling tone that made every heart in the valley stop. Shopkeepers stepped out onto the sidewalk. Mothers froze in their kitchens. The siren meant only one thing: trouble at the mine. Clara dropped her trowel. She didn't wait for a phone call. She ran to the truck, her heart hammering against her ribs. By the time she reached the mine gate, a crowd was already forming. Ambulances were screaming up the access road. The mine superintendent was standing on a crate, trying to calm the shouting families. "We've lost contact with Section 4, he said, his face pale. "There's been a seismic event. We're sending in the rescue teams." Clara felt her knees give way. Section 4. That was Silas. She didn't scream. She just stared at the black mouth of the shaft, whispering his name over and over. Down below, the dust was settling. Silas did a head count. There were 5 of them: himself, Jimmy, Tom, and 2 bolters. Frank and Miller. Everyone was battered, bruised, but alive. For now, Silas checked his multi-gas detector. The methane levels were rising. Slowly, but rising. And the oxygen. ... The oxygen was finite. "All right. Listen up," Silas said, his voice steady, anchoring the terrified men. "We're in a tight spot, but we're not dead. We've got water, and they know exactly where we are." He lied about the last part. He hoped they knew, but in a collapse this big, maps meant nothing. He instructed the men to build a barricade. It was standard procedure. Use the ventilation canvas, brattice cloth, anything to seal off a small area. This would keep the bad air out, the carbon monoxide and methane, and preserve the good air they had left. It was hard work in the dark, with limited oxygen, but it gave them something to do. It kept the panic at bay. Once the barricade was up, the waiting began. This was the hardest part. The silence returned, heavier than before. They sat in the dark to save their cap lamp batteries, huddling together for warmth. The mine, usually hot, was growing cold without the machinery running. Hours passed, or maybe days. Time loses its meaning when there is no sun. Silas sat with his back against a pillar of coal, his mind drifting. He thought about the debt they still owed on the house. He thought about his daughter's upcoming wedding. He worried that Clara wouldn't know how to fix the leak in the roof if it rained. He could hear Jimmy sobbing quietly. The kid was terrified. Silas reached out and squeezed his shoulder. "Easy, son. Save your ire. Crying takes oxygen." It was a harsh kindness, but necessary. "Tell me about your girl, Jimmy. What's her name?" "Sarah," Jimmy whispered. "We're supposed to go to the movies Friday." "You'll make it," Silas said. "You keep thinking about Sarah. You visualize her face. You hold on to that." Silas closed his eyes and tried to follow his own advice. He tried to see Clara, but all he could see was the darkness. The hallucinations began after the first 12 hours. It was the carbon dioxide building up, or just the sensory deprivation. He saw lights dancing in the corner of the tunnel. He heard his father's voice, a man who had died of black lung 10 years ago. "You digging deep enough, Silas?" His father's voice echoed. "You gotta get the clean coal." "I'm trying, Pop," Silas whispered into the blackness. "I'm trying." Above ground, the rescue operation was a frenzy of controlled chaos. Drill rigs were being brought in to bore a hole straight down into the pocket where they hoped the men were. It was a long shot. They were drilling blind, aiming for a target the size of a living room through 600 feet of hard sandstone. Clara sat in the waiting room at the mine office. She hadn't slept. She hadn't eaten. Other wives were there, a sorority of sorrow. They held hands. They prayed. They stared at the clock. Every time the door opened, the room held its breath. "We've got the drill set up," the superintendent told them. "We're starting to bore now. If they're alive, if they're in that pocket, we might be able to send down a microphone. If—" The word hung in the air like smoke. Back in the hole, the air was getting bad. Silas could feel a headache throbbing behind his eyes, a classic sign of CO2 buildup. His limbs felt heavy, like they were filled with lead. Tom had stopped talking hours ago. He was just breathing. Shallow, rasping breaths. Silas knew they were running out of time. He took out a piece of chalk from his pocket. On the slate roof above him, he began to write. It was difficult in the dark, but he knew the shapes of the letters. "Clara, I love you. Tell the kids to be good. Nitrogen monoxide regrets." He slumped back. He was so tired. It would be so easy to just go to sleep. to let the darkness take him. It felt warm now, inviting. Then a sound, not the groan of the earth. A mechanical sound, a vibration coming from the roof. Thrum! Silas's eyes snapped open. He shook Jimmy. "Wake up. Do you hear that?" The sound grew louder. A high-pitched, whining grind. It was a drill bit. Silas scrambled to his feet, grabbing a heavy wrench. He found a roof bolt and began to bang on it, rhythmically. Clang, clang, clang. 3 times. Pause. Clang, clang. Clang, the universal signal for distress. He didn't know if they could hear him through the rock, but he banged until his arms burned, until his hands bled. Suddenly, with a spray of rock dust and a hiss of air, a small metal probe broke through the ceiling of their tomb. A beam of sunlight, no wider than a pencil, shot into the darkness. It was the most beautiful thing Silas had ever seen. "Hello." A voice came through the small speaker lowered through the hole. "Is anyone down there?" Silas grabbed the microphone, his voice cracking, dry as dust. "This is Silas Vance. I've got 5 men here. We're alive, but we're fading fast." The cheer that went up in the command center was heard all the way to the parking lot. Clara collapsed into her sister's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. They were alive, but the hard part wasn't over. They had a communication line. They could pump in fresh air, but getting them out would take days. They had to drill a rescue shaft wide enough for a capsule. For the next 48 hours, Silas became the anchor. He rationed the food and water sent down the small tube. He kept the men talking. He told stories of the old days, jokes he'd heard 1,000 times. He kept them from giving up right at the finish line, when the rescue capsule finally broke through, widening the initial hole. It was chaos and joy. One by one, the men were hoisted up. Jimmy went first, then the bolters, then Tom. Silas insisted on being last. The captain always leaves the ship last. As he was strapped into the harness, Silas looked around the small, cramped space that had almost been his grave. He looked at the message scrawled on the ceiling. He reached up and wiped it away with his thumb. He wouldn't need it. Not today. The ascent was slow. He watched the layers of rock pass. By shell, sandstone, limestone. The history of the earth. And then, this guy. It was night when he emerged. The glare of the floodlights was blinding. But through the haze, he saw her. Clara broke through the police line, running toward him. He was covered in black dust, his eyes red and swollen, looking like a specter from the underworld. But when she wrapped her arms around him, he felt solid. Felt real. "I told you I'd be home for dinner," he croaked, his voice raw. "You're late," she whispered, burying her face in his dirty neck. "You're very late." The aftermath wasn't like the movies. There were no parades. The mine was closed for investigation. The bills still piled up. Silas's lungs were never quite the same. The bad air had scarred them. He had nightmares for years, waking up gasping, thinking the ceiling was coming down. But he never went back underground. He took a job at the tipple, working in the sunlight. On Sundays, he sat on his porch, watching the trucks roll by. He would look at the mountains, not with fear, but with a quiet respect. He knew what lay beneath. He knew the cost of the light that burned in every lamp in America. He knew that coal wasn't just rocks. It was compressed time. It was sacrifice. It was the blood and breath of men like him. Men who walked into the dark so the rest of the world could have the light. And every morning, when he drank his coffee and watched the sunrise over the Blue Ridge, Silas Vance tasted the sweetness of the air, a flavor that only a man who has been buried alive can truly understand. The mine eventually reopened, under a new name. New men went down. The cycle continued, but in the Vance household, the lights burned a little warmer. The silence was a little more cherished, and the gratitude for a simple breath of air never faded away. This is the legacy of the coal miner. It isn't written in history books. It's written in the dust in their lungs, the scars on their hands, and the love that waits for them at the top of the shaft.